Hello and welcome to more history stuff. So today, he says, adjusting his glasses, I want to talk about the history of Dolwyddelan Castle. This is a very atmospheric ruin up in North Wales, which I visited recently, a few months ago, and that's one of my pictures on the thumbnail. And it had a very dramatic history and quite an important one in the later medieval history of Wales going into the Tudor period. And it's a little bit neglected, especially compared to the English built castles in North Wales, particularly the ones built by Edward I, Conwy, Carnarvon, Harlech, etc. Which is a bit of a shame because it was a Welsh castle and the history is every bit as fascinating as that of the Edwardian castles and shouldn't be neglected. So this is my small effort to redress the balance a bit. So Dolwyddelan was probably built in the mid-13th century by Llywelyn Fawr, Llywelyn the Great, a very important figure in 13th century Wales, the Prince of Gwynedd, Lord of Snowdon, North Wales, who united much of the country under his banner. Although, unlike his grandson, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, Llywelyn the Last, Llywelyn Fawr doesn't seem to have ever called himself Prince of Wales as such, or King of Wales. The only titles he used were the Lord of Snowdon and the Prince or Princeps of North Wales. And it used to be thought that he was actually born at Dolwyddelan, but that's probably not the case because it probably didn't exist when he was born in the late 12th century. There's a very overgrown site nearby, you can see it from the battlements, which I believe is called Castell y Tomen, which was probably a motte and bailey castle that existed before Dolwyddelan was built, and it was probably there that Llywelyn Fawr was born. Otherwise, we don't know a great deal about the history of the castle until 1283, when the forces of Edward I, who were poised to complete their conquest of Gwynedd and the conquest of Wales, arrived at Dolwyddelan. And by this point, the castle had been built in stone. Much of what you see today is the ruins of the castle that would have existed and been visible to Edward's soldiers in 1283. And it occupied a very important position. It was really part of the gateway, the outer defences of Gwynedd, which was the mountain stronghold of the Lords of North Wales, which the English had always struggled to penetrate, to get into and get past these natural defences. And for Edward I to complete his conquest, he really needed to get into the mountain citadel and conquer all of these very difficult to get at mountain strongholds. And this is where things get interesting, because there's some quite good evidence to suggest that the constable of Dolwyddelan, a Welshman named Gruffydd ap Tudor, member of the one of the branches of the Tudor dynasty in North Wales, that he was actually present at Edward's court in Westminster in London in early December 1283, being paid double his wages, double the salary he was entitled to as Constable of Dolwyddelan. And he was there on the 5th of December. His lord, his master, Prince Llywelyn, the Prince of Wales, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, known as Llywelyn the Last, he was killed just 5 days later in mid-Wales in this very murky, mysterious ambush. And it's interesting, to say the least, to find that the man who was entrusted with guarding or defending the defences of Llywelyn's mountain home, his chief stronghold, had apparently been bribed by Edward I and was present at the King's Court, a long way away in London, very long way away from Dolwyddelan, only a few days before Llywelyn was killed. And you have to wonder what kind of sort of murky arrangement had taken place. And then a man of the same name was appointed by the king as Constable of Dolwyddelan after the conquest of Wales had been completed, and he held it for many years. The records are a little bit spotty, but it's quite likely that this is the same man throughout. This is one of the many Welshmen, it has to be said, who abandoned Prince Llywelyn, possibly because they thought that his cause was doomed and that it was futile to try and resist King Edward, and that the most sensible, pragmatic thing to do was to just come to a private arrangement with the king and preserve oneself and one's family rather than go down with an already sinking ship. Edward's forces, they actually take control of Dolwyddelan. They physically move into it and occupy the castle on the 18th of January 1283. And in the following months and years, some money is spent on refortifying it. Bits of the castle appear to have been damaged, so possibly there was some kind of siege before the garrison surrendered, or perhaps more likely, given what I've just described, the garrison abandoned the castle and then sort of did some damage as a sort of parting shot before they left and before Edward's men could take control. A few £100 was spent on repairing and extending the castle a little bit, and an English constable initially appointed, and then Tudor ap Tudor was reinstalled to hold the castle for the king. After that, it dips out of sight, but that was very far from the end of the history of the castle. You have to fast forward a long time to the 15th century. We're talking well over 150 years before it really reappears in the record. And by this point, it had been occupied by an outlaw. And this is where I have to check my notes because it gets quite complicated. So forgive me if I'm looking down at my camera. So it was occupied by an outlaw whose name was Hywel ap Ieuan. And this man was a grandson of Rhys Gethin, who had been one of the chief supporters of Owain Glyndŵr, the famous Welsh patriot, freedom fighter in the early 15th century. And presumably the castle had been derelict or only occupied by a few, like a skeleton staff, and perhaps Hywel and his outlaw band were able to occupy an empty castle or chase out whoever was there. But they occupied it and immediately entered into this sort of local gang warfare with another Welsh outlaw whose name was Dafydd ap Siancyn. Dafydd was a poet as well as an outlaw and a thief, and he was a supporter of the House of Lancaster. We're into the 1460s now, which is the time of the Wars of the Roses, in which Wales and the Welsh gentry were very much involved. Dafydd was this very dynamic, interesting figure, sometimes called the Welsh Robin Hood, except unlike Robin Hood, he actually existed. And he and the man who was taken over control of Dolwyddelan, they engage in this very bitter struggle for control of the castle and the surrounding area of North Wales. And in one of the more sort of dramatic episodes, Dafydd actually launches this raid on the castle, and he seizes Hywel and his concubine, his mistress, while they lay in bed together, and brought them as prisoners to Conwy Castle. Conwy had been one of Edward I's major strongholds, briefly taken by the Welsh during the revolt of Owain Glyndŵr before the English took it back again. But the fact that Dafydd was able to seize his enemy and spirit him and his mistress off as prisoners to Conwy Castle implies that there was some controlling interest. The Welsh had got some control of Conwy Castle by this point. We're up to 1468 now, and things start to get even more eventful, hence I'm reading off my notes. In 1468, the Yorkist king, Edward IV, sent William Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke, possibly the most important Welsh noble of this period, to root out Dafydd and his Lancastrians from North Wales. So the Wars of the Roses was still being played out inside Wales because the Welsh Lancastrians held out even after their allies and their comrades in England had been very thoroughly defeated. And Herbert, otherwise known as Gwilym Ddu by the Welsh, Black William, implying this very sort of dark reputation, he marched into this part of Wales called Nant Conwy, burning and killing until the entire Comalt, the entire region, was brought to utter desolation. And Dafydd himself, Dafydd ap Siancyn, was killed. Although the circumstances are unclear, according to an englyn, which is a Welsh verse, he composed himself while he was bleeding to death on his deathbed. He had suffered 3 fatal wounds in a brawl. Now this might have been a fight against the Yorkists, or he had got into a tavern brawl or something. But at any rate, he was dead. and that was the end of him. And this very brutal and destructive campaign that Herbert waged in North Wales left much of Nant Conwy waste. The castle and the township were abandoned, and the woods left swarming with thieves and outlaws, the sort of broken men who were left behind once the Yorkists had finished going through it. So by this point the castle is definitely abandoned, along with the adjoining town. They're just derelict, these sort of burnt out wrecks. And the place is a no-go zone. You know, no sensible man would enter this sort of bandit-haunted wilderness unless he had an army at his back. Unless your name happens to be Meredydd ap Ieuan. Now, who was Meredydd ap Ieuan? Well, he was another very sort of enterprising Welshman who came from a different part of Wales. He came from Meirionydd, and he saw a business opportunity. He thought if he could regain control of the castle and the surrounding area and revive them by moving in his own tenants and setting up a new administration, charging new rents and tithes and so forth, he could once again make Nant Conwy profitable, centred upon the castle of Dolwyddelan, and make a big fat profit. It was very dangerous, of course, because there were outlaws and thieves and bandits all over the place, but he was evidently not bothered about that, and he went in and he did actually recover the castle and the town, move in his own tenants, and start charging apparently very extortionate rents. And his successors were the Wynn family of Gwydir. And it should be said that this family, the Wynns, were actually the the blood descendants of the old medieval lords of Gwynedd, of Llywelyn ap Gruffydd and Llywelyn Fawr, who I mentioned earlier. We're into the Tudor period now, but the bloodline still existed, despite Edward I's conquest and the many years in between. So you could say that the castle and the lands and this part of North Wales had been recovered by the descendants of the old princes of Wales who had been destroyed by Edward I during the English conquest of Wales. And that would be fine, and it would be true enough, except that the Wynns were absolutely notorious. They treated their tenants appallingly, even by the standards of Tudor gentry, who tended to be pretty oppressive and extortionate, especially towards their own tenants. And apart from that, the Wynns also fought each other in the courts, and quite literally. They spent the next 100 years, all through the Tudor period, from the reign of Henry VII to the end of Elizabeth I, basically forever suing each other in the courts over all these competing claims to land and money. They were repeatedly accused of using violent means to evict their tenants. And they were a pretty brutal, unsavoury lot, and not very attractive. And the most notorious member of the family, Sir John Gwynn of Gwydir, who flourished in the latter part of the 16th century, he was probably the worst of the whole lot. I mean, this man was absolutely notorious. He was accused of all sorts of crimes. Apart from treating his own tenants appallingly, he was accused of embezzlement, corruption, of pressing men, forcing them to join the military to go and fight in Ireland when they didn't want to go, or they shouldn't have been sent because they were too sick, they were unfit for military service, but Wynn sent them anyway so he could get his hands on their lands and their tenements. He was accused of driving out tenants at sword point so he could take the property under direct control and get people in who could pay higher rents. And he was so corrupt and considered so terrible that he landed up in prison, at least twice, I think. But fortunately for him, he had friends in high places in the court of Elizabeth I, and despite his many and endless crimes, he was eventually released, and he died at a very advanced age, very rich, very comfortable, and still protesting in his writings, because he wrote up a history of the family, very dodgy. He invented all sorts of tall tales and told all sorts of lies about the history of his family and of his own career. But even towards the very end, he was still protesting that he'd done nothing wrong and that people had charged him unfairly, and how terrible it all was. When in reality he was just this extremely corrupt, bent landlord, basically. So that's, in a nutshell, up to the Tudor period, end of the Tudor period, is the history of Dolwyddelan. So it goes from being this stronghold built by the medieval lords of Gwynedd in the 13th century to an English fortress conquered by the armies of Edward I, albeit run by a Welsh constable who was friendly to the king. And then it falls into disuse before being reoccupied by outlaws who then fight over it in this very sort of dramatic, almost romantic feud until it's made derelict during the Wars of the Roses, when William Herbert, Black William, comes and burns and pillages everything, drives everyone out, and is then brought up by this very ambitious rising gentry family who, whilst they are quite successful, they're also extremely unpleasant and corrupt. So there's all kinds of ups and downs and nuances and subtleties to the history of Dolwyddelan, and that might be taken, in my opinion, as sort of symbolic of the history of Wales in general, especially from the medieval to the Tudor period. It's very, very shades of grey, not much in the way of sort of black and white, goodies and baddies. There's all sorts going on, and we should always, in my opinion, take a much closer look at what was really going on, because the record survived. There's more than enough information, and it's when you take a closer look at these things, it's a much more interesting story than the sort of surface readings that you might have been led to believe. Okay, so that was my potted nutshell history of Dolwyddelan. I hope you enjoyed that. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, leave some comments below if you wish, and I'll wish you a lovely Sunday, in as much as possible with all this wind and rain and snow. Okay, thank you. See you next time. Goodbye.